Welcome, everyone. And let's get started with Chapter 12, The Stages of Learning. This is one of those chapters that quietly changes how you see every skill you'll ever teach, coach, or perform. Here is the central idea, and we'll keep circling back to it all session. When a person learns a motor skill, both the performer and the performance change in distinct, predictable ways. Not randomly, and not all at once, but in recognizable stages. Before we go any further, do a quick mental exercise with me. Pick a skill you're genuinely good at today. Maybe it's driving, typing, shooting a free throw, playing an instrument, even tying your shoes. Now, rewind to your very first attempt at it. Awkward, slow, full of mistakes, right? You had to consciously think about every tiny piece. Compare that to how you do it now, almost without thinking at all. That enormous gap between the beginner you were and the skilled performer you became is the whole subject of this chapter. Over the next 3 sections, we'll learn to describe that journey precisely, understand exactly what is changing inside the learner along the way, and see why all of it matters for anyone who teaches movement or helps someone recover it. Keep your personal example in your back pocket, because I'll ask you to apply these ideas to it again and again as we go.
Here's the plan for today, and it comes in 3 parts that build on one another. In part 1, we'll look at the major models researchers use to map the stages of learning. Think of these as 3 different lenses pointed at the same journey from beginner to expert. In part 2, we get concrete and specific. We'll examine what actually changes as a person practices. Things like coordination, attention, energy use, and even activity in the brain. And in part 3, we'll talk about expertise, what truly separates elite performers from the rest of us, including one finding that genuinely surprises most students. By the end of the hour, you should be able to do 2 things: describe how a learner changes from one stage to the next, and explain why a good teacher has to meet each learner where they actually are. I want you to notice that second goal, because it is the practical heart of the chapter. This is not abstract theory for its own sake. It directly changes how you would coach a nervous beginner versus a seasoned athlete, or how a physical therapist would work with a patient in week 1 versus week 10. Everything we discuss should eventually answer the question, so what should the instructor do? Let's begin with the models.
Let's start with part 1, the models that describe the stages of learning. You might reasonably ask, why do we need models at all? Here's the answer. If we can describe the typical path a learner travels, then we can predict what they're going to struggle with at each point, and we can tailor our instruction to fit. A model is really just an organized map of a complicated process, and a good map saves you from getting lost. We'll cover 3 influential views in this section. The first, from Vids and Posner, focuses on what's happening in the learner's mind. The second, from Ann Gentile, focuses on the learner's goals. The third, from Nikolai Bernstein, focuses on the deep problem the body is actually solving. Here's the key thing to keep in mind. These 3 models do not contradict each other. They are not competing theories where one wins and the others lose. Instead, each one zooms in on a different aspect of the very same process. So as we go through them, don't try to pick a favorite. Try to see how they fit together, like 3 maps of one territory, each drawn at a different scale and for a slightly different purpose. Before we get to the formal models, let's sit for a moment with the core observation that started all of this. Everyone, no matter the skill, seems to pass through recognizable stages when they learn. And here's the striking part. The very same skill feels like a completely different experience depending on which stage you're in. Look at the 2 cards on the screen. On the left, the beginner. When a beginner serves a tennis ball, their head is flooded with conscious questions all at once. How do I hold the racket? How high should I toss? Am I shifting my weight at the right moment? Where are my feet? Every single movement is a deliberate, effortful decision. Now look at the right, the skilled performer. For them, that same serve simply happens. It runs on autopilot while they think about strategy or the score. Now, here's a consequence that genuinely trips people up, and it's worth pausing on. Experts often make surprisingly poor teachers of beginners. Why would that be? Because the expert genuinely cannot remember what it feels like to think the whole thing through step by step. It's been automatic for them for years. So a big theme of this chapter, and a real skill for you to develop, is the ability to deliberately step back into the beginner's point of view, to remember how overwhelming and uncertain it all felt at the start. That empathy is what lets you give instructions a beginner can actually use. That insight quietly sets up everything that follows.
Our first model is the classic one, proposed by Paul Fitts and Michael Posner back in 1967. It is still cited constantly today, which tells you how well it is held up. They suggested that learning any motor skill moves through 3 stages along one continuous timeline of practice. Stage 1 is the cognitive stage. The word cognitive just means thinking, and that's exactly what dominates here. The beginner is essentially asking, what am I supposed to do, and how do I do it? There's a lot of mental effort, a lot of large and obvious errors, and big inconsistency from one attempt to the next. Stage 2 is the associative stage. The transition into it happens gradually, after a good deal of practice. Now the learner has the basic idea, so the job shifts to refining. Errors become smaller and less frequent, performance grows more consistent, and importantly, the learner begins to detect their own mistakes. Stage 3 is the autonomous stage. Autonomous means self-governing, and that's the point. The skill now runs almost automatically, performed consistently with very little conscious thought. Notice the arrow running along the bottom of the slide. These stages are not 3 sharp steps you jump between. It's a smooth, gradual slide from beginner toward expert, which is why it can be hard to tell exactly which stage someone is in at a given moment. And one more crucial point, not everyone reaches that autonomous stage. Getting there depends on the quality of instruction and the amount and type of practice. We'll come back to that idea in part 3.
Let's slow down and put the 3 Fitts and Posner stages side by side, because the contrast between them is where the real understanding lives. Read down each column with me. In the cognitive stage, the learner's mental focus is simply figuring out what to do. Errors are frequent and large, performance is highly variable and inconsistent, and essentially all of their attention is consumed by the movement itself. There's nothing left over. Move to the middle column, the associative stage, and everything settles down a notch. The learner is now linking specific cues in the environment to the right movements. Errors shrink in both size and frequency. Consistency steadily improves. And for the first time, a little attention is freed up to spare. Then the autonomous stage on the right. Here the movement is so well grooved that the mind is free to focus elsewhere. Errors are rare and minor. Performance is reliably consistent, and almost no conscious attention is required at all. If you remember just one row from this whole table, make it the attention row. Watch how attention travels from totally consumed at the start to some to spare in the middle to barely needed at the end. That single thread, the freeing up of attention, explains so much of what skilled performance looks and feels like. And we'll pick that thread right back up in part 2 when we talk about what changes as we learn.
Now let's bring in our second model from Anne Gentile. What's nice here is that she looks at learning from a different angle than Fitts and Posner. Instead of describing what's happening in the learner's mind, she organizes everything around the learner's goals. What is the person actually trying to accomplish at each point? She describes 2 stages. In the initial stage, the beginner really has 2 jobs. The first is to find a movement that works, even if only some of the time, that achieves the goal of the skill. The second is subtler, but just as important, to learn to tell the relevant features of the environment from the irrelevant ones. Researchers call these regulatory and non-regulatory conditions. Regulatory conditions are the features your movement actually has to conform to. Here's a simple example. When you reach for a cup, its size, its shape, and where it sits on the table all shape how you move, so those are regulatory. The cup's color, though, is irrelevant to the reach. That's non-regulatory. Beginners have to learn which is which. Then come the later stages, where the goals expand to 3. Make the movement adaptable to any situation,
make it consistent so you hit the goal reliably, and make it efficient, what Gentile calls an economy of effort. And here's the clever twist in her model that sets up our very next slide. What adaptable actually means depends entirely on the type of skill you're learning.
This is, in my opinion, the single most useful distinction in Gentile's model, so let's make sure it lands. In the later stages of learning, your goal depends on whether you're learning a closed skill or an open skill. Closed skills are performed in a stable, predictable environment, one that holds still and waits for you. Because the conditions don't change, the goal is what Gentile calls fixation. You groove one reliable movement pattern and refine it until it's automatic and consistent. Think of shooting free throws, shooting arrows in archery, or signing your name. The basket isn't moving, so you just need the same excellent shot, over and over. Open skills are the opposite. They're performed in a constantly changing environment that won't wait for you. Because conditions keep shifting, the goal is diversification. You build a movement you can vary and adapt on the fly. Think of returning a tennis serve you've never seen before, or walking down a crowded hallway where people keep cutting in front of you. The situation never repeats exactly, so you must read it and adjust in the moment. Here's why this matters so much for practice design. Same learner, same later stage, but completely different practice goals. If you're coaching a closed skill, you drill for consistency and repeat realistic conditions. If you're coaching an open skill, you deliberately vary the conditions so the learner builds the capacity to adapt. Match your practice to the skill type and you'll get far better results.
Our third voice is the Russian scientist Nikolai Bernstein, and he gives us the most poetic and I think the most profound way to think about all of this. Bernstein said that learning a skill is fundamentally like solving a problem, specifically a movement problem, and he compared the whole process to staging a play. Think about what that involves. First, you assign roles to the actors, then you rewrite and refine the script, and then everyone rehearses over and over until all the parts finally move together in harmony. Learning a skill, he argued, works the same way. Different levels of your motor system take on roles, the plan gets refined, and eventually the pieces coordinate smoothly and automatically. His famous phrase is right there on the slide, and it's worth memorizing. Practice is repetition without repetition. Sit with that for a second, because it sounds like a contradiction. What he means is this. When we practice well, we are not mindlessly repeating the exact same solution over and over like a copy machine. We are repeating the process of solving the movement problem, and we solve it a little differently every single time because no two movements are ever truly identical and no two situations are exactly the same. This reframing is genuinely powerful for teaching. Good practice is not boring, identical drilling. It's repeatedly working through the same problem under slightly varied conditions, which is exactly what builds a flexible, robust skill. Hold on to that phrase. It'll echo through the rest of the chapter.